Manage mentoring for getting started in beekeeping. Swarm management, swarm triggers. I am Kevin England. In this lesson, we'll talk about swarm triggers, what they are, and we'll review various swarm triggers as it relates to honeybee colonies looking to swarm. Following triggers, we will explore indications within the colony that can tip you off that a colony swarm event is imminent. A swarming trigger is something that incites action in the bees. It's something that, when this event or biological factor emerges, it may play a role in inciting the colony to begin the swarming process. On the slide are some examples that we will review, and for the sake of discussion, I have classified the triggers into two forms, systemic and biological. One of the fundamental triggers that will implore a honeybee colony to begin swarming is crowding and congestion. By our way of thinking, this comes in two forms. The first occurrence is simply way too many bees in the living cavity. Bees need room to work, and they can sense the impact of too much going on within the space. This is remarkable from both an activity standpoint and atmosphere standpoint, as a lot of bees in a small space create quite a bit of heat, and it is a busy, congested place. The second form of crowding comes in the form of no workable space available. In the abundance of forage from spring bees, they will want to store whatever they can collect. When there's no space to place things, something has to go, and this can serve as an indicator to the bees that a change needs to be made. One observation that's been noted by researchers is that a queen may avoid operations at the bottom of a congested and busy hive. That's not to say the queen will not lay eggs and create brood at the bottom of the frames, but as a general principle, she may not be very active in the fringe areas of the hive, especially if there's considerable work being done from bees coming in and out during an active forage season. Lack of queen presence in certain areas of the hive may also be a trigger for swarm impulses. It's a common notion from beekeepers that the queen is the one who dictates what goes on inside the colony. Factually, though, a lot of the direction of the superorganism is driven by the workers. They're in touch with the comb, with the resources coming in, with the congestion and the general operation. And a lot of what actually occurs from a trajectory standpoint is driven by the workers and not the queens. It is the possibility that workers will end up being the triggers based on what they know is going on inside the colony for the swarm impulses. This is a likely but unusual trigger that has been documented as a potential factor for swarming impulses. When worker bees are bringing back resources and there's no place to put them, it might result in part of their workforce becoming idle due to the recognition that foraging is not conducive because there's no place to put the bounty. If the cache of idle and unemployed bees have nothing to do, this creates a situation that could be a trigger for the swarming impulse. A typical normal operation of the hive includes the dissemination of queen pheromone throughout the superorganism. When an overabundance of bees has an impact on the far reaches of the colony coming into contact with the queen pheromone, lack of queen pheromone distribution could be a trigger to incite swarm impulses. Somewhat related to the abundance of resources, if the queen does not have any cells to use in the brood nest to lay eggs, she may traverse the comb to the far ends of the frames and lay eggs in queen cups. There really isn't a lot known about this dynamic, but some speculate that the lack of room for laying in the brood cavities caused the queen to lay eggs in queen cups, which, as you might imagine, is a trigger for swarm impulse. One cannot underestimate that there is a genetic trait in play sometimes that can trigger swarming. Some bees are predispositioned to swarm based on their biology. It's said that certain races of bees have higher propensity for this genetic trait. As an aside, it could be said that sometimes the bees will swarm once, and if the conditions are conducive to issue a second swarm, additional swarms will be issued with any of the virgin queens that were created within the colony. We're now going to turn away from triggers and turn to indicators. These are things that you should be looking for, potential items to spot that would indicate to you that some sort of trigger has been fired and now the bees are preparing to swarm. To understand the precursor to swarming, think about it from the colony perspective. They have to have a healthy hive, one that has plenty of resources and is provisioned with many bees. At least half, maybe more, of the colony will leave with the swarm, and if they started with a small colony, they would not be able to sustain the mother, and a small quantity of bees is not going to do well when it casts off. Of course, they need to make daughter queens. One of the dynamics of a swarm is that the mother of the colony, the primary queen, leaves with the swarm and leaves the daughters behind. With the bees that leave, they need a mix of all ages. They need new bees to be able to make wax, as only young bees can make wax, but they also need foragers and a mix of drones and so on when they go to their new colony. And so think of it from the perspective of, does the colony have all the resources they need? And if so, then they're a candidate for swarming. The quintessential precursor that a colony is intending to swarm is when it produces queen swarm cells during the swarm season. If you find cells that are either charged with larvae and royal jelly, or they've made it all the way to being capped, you can be assured that the colony has made plans to swarm. When you think about it from the indicator perspective, not only is congestion a trigger for the bees, it should be an obvious sign for you to recognize the energy for the colony to cast off a swarm has been fully realized. We've already established that hive congestion is a trigger, but it's also an indicator for you and unemployed bees and/or bearding behavior, which is where the bees come out onto the front of the hive, hang off the front entrance, collect on the front of the colony. It means there's high congestion, high heat, and/or bees need to come out of the cavity so that there's room to work. These are both swarm indicators for you visually to know that swarm is right around the corner. Interestingly enough, the queen can play a direct role as an indicator for swarming. It's well documented that older queens have a higher propensity for swarming. If you know from your notes that your queen is older, chances are she might be more conducive to swarm in the spring. On the opposite of that, it is known biologically that younger queens have less tendency to swarm just because of the genetic makeup. It's somewhat of a biological phenomena. The colony survives best when it has a young queen operating the superorganism. Now, an additional indicator, which generally is not observable by us, is that a queen is coerced in the time of swarming by the workers to thin down so that she can fly when the swarm casts off. Remember, she operates in the colony for long extended period of times and never leaves except for her nuptial flights. The bees will physically stop feeding her and make her more active so that she can be thinned down in order to swarm away. It's not something that you as the beekeeper generally can see unless you're really astute and looking at your queen all the time, but do know that this is an indicator that a hive is intending to swarm. There's a similar colony dynamic that you can observe in the form of the activity slowdown of the entire colony. Work inside the colony, in addition to foraging, slow down as bees muster to swarm. You're going to see less work at the entrance, and the bees will behave in a manner which could be described as preoccupied as they await the command to cast off for the swarm. A lot of times they will gorge themselves on food in the context that they're not sure when they'll get settled in the destination. This is a late sign and not overly easy to spot, but if you're observant, you can pick this activity up. Of mustering for a swarm is the moment nears for swarming, the energy of the colony ramps up considerably. Again, if you're present to witness this, you could see what would be commonly described as a fervor. The bees that play a role to make the notification that it's time to swarm will begin to project the signal by becoming extremely active. The image on the slide is a video I'm going to play for a moment. If you look closely in this video, you might note some of the bees acting in a manner that was just described. They're moving quickly, coming into contact with a lot of bees, and it could be said that this hive swarmed about 15 minutes after this video was captured. As I look at some of these bees and I see the way the different bees are going about and interacting with the others, they look like some of the streaker bees where they go around and tell everybody, we're going to swarm, we're going to swarm. You see certain ones going around and communicating with other ones? Sometimes you even see them jumping on top of the other bees and shaking them, which I've seen over and over again before a hive swarms. There is one indicator that is unlike others, and it has to do with monitoring sensors that you can place in your hive. The sensors can pick up patterns from the activities of the bees, and it's well established that when certain patterns are recognized, it becomes a clear indicator that a swarm is either imminent, underway, or has occurred based on when you encounter the data from the sensor. Some systems will even watch for the activity and send you a notification when it's observed. This lesson introduced some information about swarm triggers and indicators. On our next lesson, we'll talk about management techniques that you can employ to head off a swarm, as well as management practices you might take if a swarm is imminent. We'll move on from there to the practice of making splits, which is a common management practice to prevent swarming. If you have questions, you can ask at our next online session. You can also send an email to the address on the slide. If you're watching from YouTube, you can leave a comment below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you at the next lesson.